You can have a seat, Mr. O'Brien.
The reason I've come in before we bring the jury in is that I want to make a ruling here that helps clarify what you're trying to do, both of you. Initially, I made an order that the district attorney was permitted to bring in general financial information to provide evidence from which the jury may or may not infer that the defendant had financial problems, from which they may or may not infer that that gives him some motive to commit the crimes the DA alleges he's committed. The offer of proof that was made in the memorandum that you submitted, your trial memorandum, was within what I perceived. The thing that I'm uncomfortable with, and have been for a few minutes, is the constant having your expert refer to, letter after letter from his advisors about his financial condition. The expert has testified that he relied on the balance sheet and income expenditure statements, which is basically what you expect an expert to rely on. And to some extent certainly he would rely on other people's opinions, financial advisors of Mr. Jackson. But it's not the kind of evidence that I'm going to allow you to continue to bring up. So you can. My ruling is that his quotes from, that he wants to make or you want him to put into evidence from Michael Jackson's advisors are to stop at this point. I have advised them that those have limited value to them, since they can't accept those for the truth of the matter asserted. But I think if we continue in that vein, it's not the right way to present the evidence.
May I just tell the court how I intend to finish up, just so we're...
They can't hear you.
May I just tell the court how I intend to finish up?
You may.
Basically, just so you know, Your Honor, we wanted to do this with balance sheets. And as you know, we weren't.
I don't want to hear that. What do you want to tell me?
We're at the end of his testimony. And we're going to finish with the two summaries that were provided by the Bank of America. Now, these are actual letters that were STT'd from Bank of America to representatives. And just so you know, the testimony is bookended by the statement, balance statement, and these letters.
Let me see the letters.
Okay. Well, I have a copy, but...
Have you seen the letters, counsel?
I'm not sure what he's talking about.
This would be the Jane Heller letter and the Maiorella letter from the Bank of America indicating the status of the loan balances as of 2004.
I have them here, if you want.
May I take a look, Your Honor?
Well, after me.
Okay, excuse me.
Jane Heller and Maiorella.
So these are the status of the loans in 2004?
Yes. And these provide conclusive evidence that everything that was predicted, everything that was stated by all of the letters that we have indicated, was borne out in the resulting accumulation of debt and of what the...
Yeah, but the issue isn't what his financial status is today or whether you were right or wrong.
I know, the issue is.
The issue is what was his frame of mind in 2000, late 2002 and 2003.
And that's what?
And not whether he was even right. He could have been absolutely wrong. So.
That's true.
So his financial statement today isn't at issue.
Well, I'm just saying that's why the letters are so important, because they impute knowledge of the defendant.
Today.
No, the ones that we've introduced so far. And this basically confirms that the letters were all correct, and that they also further show what was going on in 2003.
What they show is, in hindsight, he was in trouble. But that's not the issue.
Alright, so.
Did you look at the letters, Mr. Mesereau?
I've looked at them, Your Honor. And I would object based on what the court just said. The point of their presentation is not to talk about.
They can't hear you.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. The point they're trying to prove is not what is his financial status today. They're allegedly trying to suggest there was a motive in 2003 to conspire to do criminal acts because of financial concerns, which of course we vigorously dispute. But nevertheless, the issue is what is relevant to a possible motive in 2003, specifically between January and March. Nothing after that date would have any relevance to what they claim they're trying to prove.
Our point is that these letters tell what happened in 2003, tell what was going on at that time.
I must have misread them. Do you want to give them back to me? I thought they were talking about right now.
Well, they're talking about how the debt has accumulated.
They're talking about right now, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
All right, give them back to him.
but it's the genesis of those problems that exist in 2003.
Do you understand what I'm saying, counsel?
I do.
Do you understand the limitations that I gave you on the financial material?
That it was to be concise.
I think now the limitation is this: that I don't want you asking him any more quotes from any of his advisors. You are apparently not going to do that.
All right.
And I don't think it's, and I will rule that an opinion as to his present financial status would be improper.
Very good. I'll just finish up with his opinions about the defendant's financial status in 2003.
At that time. All right.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. You can bring in the jury. Counsel?
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. O'Brien, where we left off, I was drawing your attention back to the summary your opinions, and I'm going to ask you at this time, based upon your review of all the records in this case, including the records you've testified about, can you walk us through your opinions about Mr. Jackson's financial condition as of the February to March period of 2003? What are your opinions, sir?
Again, they are that Mr. Jackson's financial condition has deteriorated, up and leading to that point of time, February of 2003. The expenditures have exceeded income. The liabilities have increased, and there is a liquidity crisis or a cash crisis which looms and has been ongoing. And I believe those conditions were known as of February 2003.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. O'Brien.
Cross-examine?
Yes, please, Your Honor. Good afternoon.
That it is. Good afternoon.
My name is Thomas Mesereau and I speak for Mr. Jackson. When you began your examination by the prosecutor for the government, you indicated there was some documents that you had wanted to see if you could, but they were not available to you, right?
That is correct.
And what documents were they?
Those would be, well, we'd like to see financial statements for 2000, for 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002, and all the way through February of 2003. In addition to that, general ledgers, which are the summation of transactions, which become financial statements. We asked for bank statements. Those types of detailed supporting documentation would be things that we would typically ask for, and we did. They were just simply not made available to us.
Okay, they were not made available to you by the prosecutor who hired you, correct?
Objection. Misstates the evidence.
Overruled. You may answer.
I was simply told that that information was not available to me.
Well, you've never spoken to anyone on the defense side, correct?
I have not, no.
The only people you spoke to about your opinions today are the prosecutors for the government, correct?
That's correct.
And when did you first talk to any prosecutor for the government?
Oh, I think the first call came to me probably back in October to November.
Okay, and who called you?
Oh, it was Mr. Auchincloss.
Okay, and have you worked with Prosecutor Auchincloss ever since?
I have not, no.
Okay, who have you worked with in the process of preparing to testify in this trial?
We've met with Mr. Auchincloss, and also a Ms. Linz, as I recall her name, Chris Linz. I met Mr. Snedden, but we really didn't talk about my testimony, per se.
Okay, now, you've indicated you wished you could have looked at financial statements for 1999, 2000, 2001 and 2002. Is that correct?
All the way up through February of 2003, actually.
Okay, so in the process of forming your opinions, and I'm speaking about the opinions you've testified to today, you haven't looked at one certified financial statement of Mr. Jackson, true?
Well, we saw the June 30th. There's a 1999 financial statement, and there's a June 30th, 2002, financial statement.
Okay, and who prepared those?
Prepared by Holthouse, as I recall.
Okay, and are they certified, to your knowledge?
Yes, they are.
Okay, and did you talk to anyone at Holthouse about what they used to prepare those statements?
No, you can see what they used to prepare the statements.
Well, you can see what they used to prepare those statements.
Yes.
You can see every document they reviewed?
No, but based on the opinion that they gave and the types of financial statements that they are.
Okay, you didn't look at general ledgers, because they were not available, correct?
That's correct.
And please tell the jury what general ledgers would have. Well, first of all, before I get into that, the financial statements you did not look at. Why would you like to have looked at those financial statements?
Because, as I mentioned in my direct, in doing a forensic accounting investigation, you want to see as much information as you possibly can. So that may lend additional information, it may not, but you certainly want to see as much as you possibly can.
And you said you would like to have looked at general ledgers, but could not, right?
That's correct.
And why would you have preferred to have looked at general ledgers?
It's just more information. Understand that the general ledgers are nothing more than a process of accumulating a bunch of different transactions that then come to an end number that then become part of the balance sheet. So it just tells you the detail that makes up the final number. It's just more information.
You didn't look at bank statements, correct?
We did not see any bank statements, no.
And had you had any bank statements available, what benefit would you have had?
Well, it would tell you cash balances. It would tell you the expenditures, at least on a cash basis. You wouldn't know the detail. It would just be like looking at your normal bank statement, just shows the check and the account. So it would show you cash balances on an ongoing basis.
And are you saying the documents you looked at did not identify for you exactly what the nature of the expenditures were?
No, there are documents within some of the Holt House memos and some of the financial consultants that talk about individual expenditures and individual expenditure levels.
Okay, you didn't look at any tax returns, correct?
No, we actually did, I think, see tax returns.
Which ones? Do you know?
I don't recall the years. Seems to me they were later years.
Okay, you didn't see any during the period you're giving an opinion on, did you?
I think we may have seen, 02, maybe, 03.
Okay, and are you sure about that?
I don't recall. There's not a lot of information that's pertinent to this analysis in a tax return.
Okay, were they corporate returns or personal? Do you know?
I believe they were personal.
Okay, now, you've indicated that you were with a financial consulting firm, correct?
That is correct.
And would one of the areas of expertise in your firm be looking at someone's bare financial condition and giving them advice how to change their condition and improve it?
I'm not sure what you mean by bare.
Well, you've given the jury your opinions about Mr. Jackson's expenditures, liabilities, and liquidity, correct?
That's correct.
You were not here to tell the jury what all of his assets were worth during that particular time period, correct?
And we don't know exactly what they were worth during that particular time frame.
Have you looked at any information in response to the prosecutor's questions that would have given you any indication what any of Mr. Jackson's assets were worth?
There were a number of different documents in those which we saw that talked about value over periods of time. For example, I think there was a value given for Neverland Ranch at some point in time. There was also an appraisal done on the MIJAC catalog at some point in time. And there was an appraisal done on the entire Sony ATV catalog at some point in time. Those would be the major assets. And we did see valuation, 2 valuations done by an appraiser, and then one I think was just a representation maybe made by IBM, as I recall.
Now, the prosecutor talked to you about a letter from a company called International Business Management. Do you remember that?
I do, yes.
That was in February of 2003, correct?
That's correct.
And do you recall that in that letter from that firm the Sony ATV catalog was estimated to be worth approximately $1 billion?
I do, yes. That's the catalog in total, yes.
And clearly if you were going to try and advise someone like Mr. Jackson, based on the information you've given the jury today, about how to restructure his affairs to not have the debt he had or to be more liquid, you would consider the possibility of selling assets, true?
I think that's a real possibility here, yes.
And if, in fact, the value of $1 billion that is found in the letter you refer to is true, clearly if you were advising Mr. Jackson how to solve any cash crisis, you would consider the possibility of liquidating that asset, true?
No, because the value of the catalog is $1 billion. Mr. Jackson's interest is not half of that $1 billion.
Well, sir, he has an interest in that catalog, correct?
Yes, but it is not worth half of $1 billion.
He purchased the catalog in approximately 1986 for about $47 million, right?
I think that's right.
He sold half of that interest in the catalog in approximately 1995 for $90 million, true?
I believe that's correct.
And in 1999, excuse me, in 2003, you see an estimated value in this particular letter of $1 billion, right?
That's correct.
And that catalog contains ownership interests in all of the Beatles' music, true?
I don't know that it's all of the Beatles' music. I think it's some of the Beatles' music.
Do you know whether or not it's all of it or not?
I don't know.
Do you know any other recording artists whose copyrighted music is contained within that catalog?
Yeah, I saw a memo on that. I don't recall the specifics, but I saw there were others involved. I think there were, Sony's copyrighted music was in there, which I think it initially was country western. But I think there were other artists in there as well as the Beatles.
Okay, now, that catalog today has been estimated to be worth a couple of $1 billion by some, and even 4 to 5 by others. Are you aware of that?
Objection. Assumes facts.
I'm not aware of that, but again.
That's overruled. The answer is he's not aware of it. Next question.
Your job was not to appraise the value of the Sony ATV catalog, correct?
No, we certainly considered the value in coming to our opinions.
Did you hire an appraiser to give you an appraisal of the value of that catalog in the year 2003?
No.
You never hired any appraiser to put a value on that catalog at any time while you were working for the government, correct?
No, I don't see the need to.
I'm going to object as relevancy as to the entire catalog. What's relevant is only the defendant's portion of it.
Your microphone, sir, is off.
The objection is overruled. The answer is in. Next question.
Did you look at the transactional documents that were drafted in the mid-90s, approximately 1995, whereby Mr. Jackson sold a half interest in that catalog to Sony?
I see the Sony ATV agreement. Is that the document you're referring to?
That and other documents that refer to that transaction.
I see, the Sony ATV agreement is what I saw.
Okay, your job was not to obtain all of the documentation that pertained to Mr. Jackson's sale of a half of his catalog to Sony, right?
Well, again, I would ask for any document that's available. And I got the documents I got, which was the Sony ATV catalog document.
Okay, and you're not aware of efforts, through the last 4 or 5 years, by anybody to try and purchase his interest, correct?
In the Sony ATV?
Yes.
Well, Mr. Jackson, I don't believe, is allowed to sell any interest until 2005.
But there are efforts to purchase it. If you can get all parties to agree, you can sell your interest, can't you?
That's true. If he gets Sony's approval, he could sell his interest, based on the agreement.
So are you aware of any efforts during the last 4 or 5 years by third parties to try and get Sony and Mr. Jackson together and purchase that catalog?
I'll object as to relevancy beyond 2003.
Sustained.
March.
Let me rephrase. Are you aware of any efforts by third parties, between 1999 and the end of 2003, to get Sony and Mr. Jackson together and work out an arrangement where Mr. Jackson's interest is sold?
Same objection. End of 2003.
Sustained.
I'll rephrase it again. Are you aware of any efforts between the years 1999 and March of 2003 by any third party to get Mr. Jackson and Sony together so they could purchase Mr. Jackson's interest in that catalog?
No, I have not seen any document like that.
Okay, now, among the documents that you were handed by Prosecutor Auchincloss, was the only reference to a value of the Sony ATV catalog the $1 billion you just referred to?
No, there was 2. The IBM memo said, I think, $1 billion, and it's June, a February 13, 03 memo. But again, that's the value of the catalog, not Mr. Jackson's interest. And there was a second document that was actually an appraisal done by an appraisal firm in, I think it was 1999, for $991 million, I believe.
Okay.
So there's 2 documents that I saw.
Now, Prosecutor Auchincloss showed you documents from March of 2003 that were written to Mr. Jackson by an attorney named David Legrand, correct?
Objection. Misstates the evidence as to the date of the documents.
You'd have to refer me to that document. I'm sorry.
Just a moment.
I'm sorry.
Well, I guess the district attorney is saying that's not the correct date. Do you have a document that's dated March of 2003?
Yes, I do. Did the prosecutor in the course of your work for him show you a document dated March 18, 2003, to Mr. Jackson from a lawyer named David Legrand?
I don't recall seeing that document.
Okay. Might it refresh your recollection if I just show you the one I have?
Please.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
May I see what you've got?
I don't recall seeing this memo before.
So you're saying the prosecutor didn't give you this document when he was preparing you?
No, I'm not suggesting that. It's just I have not seen that document.
Okay, well, how many documents did you look at in preparing to testify?
As I mentioned earlier, there was about 6 boxes, something like that, of documents.
Okay, do you recall seeing the name David Legrand in the documents?
I do, yes. There's documents from IBM to David Legrand.
Do you recall that he was giving Mr. Jackson advice about how to handle his financial situation?
I do recall that, yes.
Do you recall him suggesting that if Mr. Jackson
I'm going to object to counsel reading.
sold his, Your Honor, can I
Reading from the letter.
complete the question?
That he says he doesn't know about.
Sustained.
If Mr. Jackson sold his interest in March of 1993, excuse me, March of 2003 in the Sony ATV joint venture, okay.
Yes, I gotcha.
That's assuming the parties got together and all agreed Mr. Jackson can sell his interest, all right?
That's what I believe would have to happen, yes.
Yes. He could have paid off the Bank of America loan. He could have ended up worth $200 million after taxes, excluding royalty income, true?
I've never seen that document, so I can't tell you that's true or not.
Okay, but you were given some documents by the prosecutor that Mr. Jackson had gotten from his lawyer, Mr. Legrand, true?
Yes, we were.
And you saw some documents that said, Hale Lane, on them, correct? The law firm the lawyer belonged to, right?
We've seen those documents, yes.
Okay, and you don't recall a document dated March 18 where Mr. Legrand told him how to solve his liquidity problem and be worth $200 million before he got a royalty.
Objection. Assumes facts. Argumentative.
The objection is sustained.
Did you ever ask Prosecutor Auchincloss if he had any documents available to him where any of Mr. Jackson's advisors gave him advice on how to solve his liquidity problem?
Well, we asked for any and all documents relevant, so if I didn't know that document exists, whatever that document is, I wouldn't have known to ask for it. So we simply asked for any and all documents relevant to financial condition issues through February of 2003.
Okay, did you ask for documents through March of 2003 from Prosecutor Auchincloss?
We asked for documents all the way through today.
Okay.
With respect to bank statements and the like.
But you have never seen any document that suggested Mr. Jackson sell that asset and analyzes what he'll be worth if he sells his interest, right?
No, I've never seen that document, no.
Okay, now, none of your calculations consider any opportunities Mr. Jackson had in the entertainment industry during those years, correct?
That's, well, I mean, it doesn't consider from an income perspective. Actually, that's not true. It does consider, because the financial consultants, the letters that the financial consultants wrote that I have looked at and relied on would assumingly take that into account. They're his business advisors and they're talking about the excess expenditures. So my guess is, not a guess. I would assume they would include all items of revenue with respect to a calculation.
Mr. O'Brien, an entertainer like Mr. Jackson doesn't just go to his CPA every time someone offers him an opportunity around the world, right?
I don't know what his relationship with his business manager was.
Well, did you know that he was offered $100 million to do a national tour in 2002?
Objection. Assumes facts.
Sustained.
Are you an expert on the music industry?
No, I'm not.
Have you done any kind of an analysis on what opportunities in the entertainment industry Mr. Jackson had between the years 1999 and March of 2003?
I did not, no. I relied on the financial consultant's information.
Now, based on what you have seen to date, Mr. Jackson has never gone bankrupt ever, has he?
Not to my knowledge.
Do you have any knowledge of what Mr. Jackson was offered to do either national or international music tours between the years 1999 and March of 2003?
No.
Did the prosecutor give you any documents about licensing opportunities for various Michael Jackson-related products that he was offered between the years 1999 and March of 2003?
I don't recall seeing any of those. There could be some in there, but I don't know that would be relevant to my calculations.
If you were trying to solve a liquidity crisis like you've identified here, wouldn't it be relevant if you knew that Mr. Jackson could accept one opportunity and solve it in a day?
Well, it could be relevant, but it isn't in this calculation, because that liquidity crisis was real. There are documents throughout that we reviewed that there was a serious cash crisis. And if it could have been solved, why wasn't it? I mean, there were documents that there's $10 million being unpaid. There's documents where vendors are threatening lawsuits. If it's that easy to fix, why don't you fix it?
If it was as bad as you said it was, why didn't he go bankrupt?
Because I think he's been able to continue to borrow.
Do you know that for a fact?
Yes, the debt's gone up.
Do you know what opportunities he had to market Michael Jackson video games, market Michael Jackson fragrances, Michael Jackson music, Michael Jackson concerts, Michael Jackson tours during that period? Do you know what cash opportunities were available to him if he wanted them?
I have no doubt that there were substantial opportunities. The issue becomes, why weren't they availed themselves? Why didn't they do that? There was a serious cash crisis. There's no doubt about that, based on the documents I've seen. And in fact, if it was so easy to do, why wasn't it done?
Maybe it wasn't as serious as you've identified.
Objection. Argumentative.
Sustained. The jury's admonished to disregard Mr. Mesereau's remark.
Did your firm ever do any independent due diligence investigation of Mr. Jackson's finances during that period?
No. Like, for example, searching the internet or something like that. I mean, we asked for documents.
Yes.
And we got the documents we got. I'm not sure, independent investigation. Do you mean by going to the internet or something like that?
If your firm had been theoretically retained by Mr. Jackson to do an analysis of his assets and liabilities, to analyze any cash liquidity problem and to make recommendations how to solve it, what would you have wanted to look at?
We would have wanted to look at the documents we requested, which were all the bank statements, all the general ledgers, all of the income statements and balance sheets and financial statements for the individual years, plus the documents that we've seen, which is the opinions and/or the correspondence from all of his advisors as they progressed through serving him and helping him with his cash crisis.
Okay, and I think it goes without saying, you didn't get all those documents to look at, correct?
As I mentioned, we didn't get all the financial statements and all the documents that we talked about, no.
Now, you asked for documents up to the present, is that correct?
As I recall, we did, yes.
Did Prosecutor Auchincloss give you documents that concerned March of 2003?
We didn't, apparently we didn't see some documents. In fact, I'm sure we didn't see all the documents, but we got what we got and those documents appeared to go through mostly 2003.
Okay, now, did you see current appraisals of all assets you believe Mr. Jackson owned when you did your analysis?
No, as I said, the only two appraisal documents we saw was an official one in 1999, and then the IBM document, which was again a valuation of the venture, not just Mr. Jackson's interest.
Now, based on what documents you saw, clearly the Sony ATV music catalog was an appreciating asset, right?
It was an appreciating asset for the catalog. I'm not sure it was an appreciating asset for Mr. Jackson's interest because of the way it was structured.
Okay, but, sir, again, if three parties, Sony, Mr. Jackson and a potential purchaser, get together, and there is an effort to buy that catalog from Sony and Mr. Jackson, terms are negotiated, and almost anything can be liquid at that point, true?
I'm sorry, anything can be liquid. Do you mean?
Sony and Mr. Jackson were certainly, based on what you know, capable of getting together and jointly selling their interests in that catalog to a third party, right?
That's my understanding. That either party could sell with the approval of the other.
Okay.
Up until December 2005.
And you knew that that catalog had originally been completely owned by Mr. Jackson, right?
That's correct. Well, he owned a portion of it. The catalog became total once Sony put their interests in as well.
Well, when Mr. Jackson initially obtained an interest in the catalog, he had a complete interest, did he not?
He had the interest in his copyrighted assets. Sony had their interest in their copyrighted assets.
I'm talking about in 1986 when he purchased it.
He had apparently 100% interest.
Okay, and you knew he had paid approximately $47 million for his interest, right?
I think that's right.
He had sold half of that interest approximately 10 years later for $90 million, right?
Objection. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
And in 2003, it was your understanding that the entire catalog was worth. At least the only estimate you saw was $1 billion, right?
Objection. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
Now, let me ask you this, because you do advise businesses on how to restructure
I do.
and improve liquidity, correct?
We do, yes.
Okay, given the rate of appreciation of that asset, based on what you know, between 1986 and 2003, can you envision a situation where Mr. Jackson says to himself, I'll deal with the liquidity crisis each year, because it's a price worth paying to hang on to this asset the way it's increasing in value?
I don't know what Mr. Jackson may have said to himself. But from a financial perspective, I would simply disagree with you that his interest is necessarily increasing each year given the financial structure of the arrangement.
But the asset could be appreciating in terms of inherent value, true?
Depends on what royalties, in fact, it's generating.
Do you know?
Actually, yes, the royalties were increasing. But again, that's the catalog in total. That's not necessarily Mr. Jackson's interest in that catalog.
Well, let me ask you this. Had you seen the letter of March 18th? Excuse me, March 19th that I just showed you from Mr. Legrand? Okay. Where his lawyer advises him, you can sell your interest, and you can end up worth $200 million after taxes.
Objection. This was. The objection was sustained previously. Hearsay.
I haven't finished the question, Your Honor.
I'll sustain the objection, though. I know it is the same question.
Motion to strike.
If you'd known that asset could be sold in March of 2003, okay. If you knew that Mr. Jackson could have been worth $200 million after taxes by doing it, excluding royalty income, let's assume those facts just for the sake of argument, all right?
Okay.
If you knew that, you wouldn't consider this liquidity crisis to be as serious as you've made it, true?
Well, the liquidity crisis was ongoing. In my mind, there's no doubt about it, in 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002, and as of February 13, 2003. In my mind, there's no question about that. If, hypothetically, Mr. Jackson could have sold his interest, Sony would have agreed, and it would have created a net cash to him of $200 million. Of course, liquidity issues would change subsequent to February 13, 2003.
Okay, I'm not talking about net cash. I'm talking about when all the dust settles and all the loans are paid, and Bank of America is out of the equation, he ends up worth $200 million free of all debt. If you knew he could have achieved that in March of 2003, would that change your opinion about the seriousness of this liquidity crisis?
As I was saying,
I'll object as to assumes facts. Argumentative. And requires speculation.
It's just using a hypothetical, Your Honor.
I'll allow the question as a hypothetical. To the jury, I've already given you some instruction on hypothetical questions. Do you remember that instruction? Vaguely. Okay, I'll give it to you after a while. Go ahead, you may answer.
As I mentioned, it would not change my opinion about his liquidity of the cash crisis up through February 13, 2003. However, if that was known at that point in time, and at the end of the day there would be $200 million of net worth in your hypothetical, clearly that would change a liquidity issue at that point in time.
And certainly if Mr. Jackson had received a letter from his attorney in March of 2003 stating an assumption like that, that would likely have changed Mr. Jackson's view of his financial situation, right?
Objection. Improper hypothetical. Argumentative.
Sustained.
Now, typically, if you were going to advise Mr. Jackson on how to handle a liquidity crisis, once you identified a liquidity crisis like you have today, logically wouldn't you sit down with the client and say, what opportunities are available to you, sir, to raise millions of dollars and help solve your short-term needs? That would be one of the questions you'd ask, right?
Certainly.
And given what you know about Mr. Jackson and the success he's had in the music business and his reputation he's had around the world, logically wouldn't one of the first questions be, Mr. Jackson, what are the opportunities available for you around the world right now to raise millions of dollars and help solve the crisis?
Would that be a question an advisor would ask? Is that your?
Wouldn't that be a logical question if you were consulting, or someone like Mr. Jackson was consulting you?
Certainly. Clearly cash needed to be raised, and that would be a question one would ask.
Okay, now, have you, in your work, advised people in the entertainment industry
No.
of how to restructure their affairs?
No, I have not.
You've never done it once?
Never once.
Well, certainly in the course of your career, you've heard from time to time about various celebrities in the entertainment industry who, for whatever reason, end up with a cash crisis, true?
Yes.
One of the reasons is sometimes work is sporadic depending on what work you do, correct?
Objection. Argumentative. Irrelevant.
Sustained.
Do you recall generally what documents you looked at when you were preparing your conclusions in this case?
Yes. As I mentioned, we saw, it was 5 to 6 boxes. There was a couple of boxes of UCC filing statements. There was also a couple of boxes of Warner Chappell royalty statements. And I think the remaining 2 boxes were miscellaneous financial documents, including correspondence from Mr. Jackson's financial advisors. And the balance sheet that I mentioned to you, as well, for 1999 and 2002.
With respect to the expenditures that you've identified as exceeding income during those years, okay?
Yes.
Am I correct in assuming that you saw some general information about how much was being spent,
Yes.
as opposed to what the individual expenditures were for? Is that correct?
We saw some specifics.
Okay.
And some summaries that the consultants included.
Okay. Did you see any year-by-year breakdowns about what Mr. Jackson was supposedly spending this money on?
Well, we showed you 1999, which summarized it by 4 or 5 different categories. There was some information in 2000. There was not, I don't recall any information in 01 or 02. So we saw some details, but principally we saw the summarized memos of his financial consultants.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the $1 billion figure you saw attributed to the Sony ATV catalog, correct?
That's correct, in the IBM memo.
And there was a second catalog as well that you became aware of, correct?
That's correct, the MIJAC catalog.
And that was a catalog devoted to Mr. Jackson's own music, right?
That is correct.
Did you see any appraisals on what the value of that catalog was?
Yes. There was one done in 1999.
And what was the value placed on that catalog based on the appraisal you looked at?
$128 million.
And do you recall who did that appraisal?
It was the same firm that did the Sony ATV catalog appraisal. I don't remember the name of the firm. It was a Los Angeles-based firm.
And I believe you testified that as part of your analysis, you considered what the Michael Jackson catalog was generating each year in terms of revenue, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Just like you took into consideration what the Sony ATV catalog was generating in terms of revenue, right?
Right.
You didn't do any analysis of whether or not, between the years 1999 and March of 2003, the Michael Jackson catalog could have been sold, correct?
Well, I think that the Michael Jackson catalog could have been sold at any point in time. I'm not aware of any restrictions similar to the ones on the Sony ATV catalogs. My assumption is that could be sold at any time.
Okay, and if it had been sold in 1999, based upon the document you looked at, the best value you could ever come up with would be $128 million, right?
$128 million would be the value of the catalog, less, of course, any debt, taxes, etc.
Right. Now, in 1999, actually, excuse me, let me just rephrase that. You're not aware of any efforts to sell the Michael Jackson catalog, correct?
I've never seen any documentation like that, no.
Okay, and I believe you testified that, from what you could see, the 3 main hard assets were the 2 catalogs and Neverland, right?
Those are the 3 main assets, yes.
Okay, and clearly, you didn't consider any analysis of what entertainment opportunities were ever available for Mr. Jackson during 1999 to March of 2003, right?
No, I did consider those, in that it doesn't matter if those opportunities were available. There was a serious cash crisis. That's a fact. That's what the documents support. Also, whether or not that could have happened, it didn't, and therefore there was a cash crisis. That's what the documents show.
And if you knew you could solve your cash crisis tomorrow by selling a portion of an asset and accepting an opportunity to tour around the world, that would make a difference in terms of the severity of that crisis, correct?
Objection. Requires speculation, assumes facts, and asked and answered.
Sustained. Assumes facts.
As you sit here today, you know that he's never gone bankrupt and he's continued to live at Neverland, correct?
Objection. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
Now, let me ask you the following. Let's assume that your conclusions are correct. In February of 2003, let's assume that your conclusions about Mr. Jackson's financial crisis are true. Okay?
Okay.
As of February of 2003, how much was he in debt?
Well, the Sony B of a loan had a balance of $200 million. The MIJAC loan had a balance of $24 million. There was apparently an additional $10.5 million owing to vendors that had not been paid.
Okay, now.
Those are the large liabilities that I can think of as I sit here right now.
Let's assume that's all correct, all right? And let's assume he doesn't want to sell his interest in the Sony ATV catalog. Let's assume he doesn't want to sell his own catalog, which was estimated to be worth $128 million in 1999, okay? Let's assume he decides to sit there and just keep living with these obligations that you've identified, all right?
Okay.
Now, let's assume he has an opportunity to make a documentary for television that can generate about $7 million, all right?
Okay.
Let's assume Fox is doing what is called a rebuttal documentary, okay? That $7 million isn't going to make much of a difference, is it?
No, it's not.
Wouldn't be worth committing a crime over $7 million in that situation, would it?
Objection. Argumentative.
Sustained.
Now, I believe you testified that on June 30, 2002, he was not bankrupt, right?
June 30, 2002?
Yes. I wrote down some notes, and if I misstated that, let me know. But did you say that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Based on the financial statements.
Yes.
I think Mr. Auchincloss asked, by definition of a negative net worth, does that mean he's bankrupt? And I said no.
Okay, and could you please explain why you felt a negative net worth did not mean you're bankrupt?
As I mentioned, that financial statement, those assets were listed in what they call a tax basis, or cash basis, which means it's the cost. So that's the cost of acquiring those assets whenever they were acquired. And liabilities are, in fact, the stated amount of the liability. We all know, for example, if you buy a house for $100,000, 2 years later it might be worth $150,000. So if that's, in fact, the case, the $100,000 asset is lower on the balance sheet than it is the fair market value. And that's the reason that you cannot draw that inference from that information, because that's stated at cost, not necessarily fair market value.
You were referring, in response to the prosecutor's questions, to a document dealing with, I gather it was a financial statement from June 30, 2002, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, now, if you were trying to determine fair market value of Mr. Jackson's assets based on that document, what would you have to do?
You'd have to go through each one of the assets and figure out what the fair market value was.
And how would you do that?
You'd have to perform an appraisal on the largest of the assets, namely, the catalogs, and Neverland Ranch and all of the furnishings and fixtures and artwork within Neverland Ranch. And then you'd have to go through the liabilities side and understand what the total liabilities were, adjusted for taxes, because assuming you have to sell all those assets, there's going to be taxes related to that. So that's how you go about it.
Did Prosecutor Auchincloss ever ask you to get an appraisal done of anything?
No.
Did Prosecutor Auchincloss ever ask you to do a fair market value analysis of anything owned by Mr. Jackson?
No, but as part of the work that we were performing, we did look at and consider the value of the MIJAC catalog and the Sony ATV, Mr. Jackson's interest in that.
But you didn't actually have it appraised by someone capable of appraising its value, true?
There was no appraisal done, no.
Okay, and you would agree that to put a value on something like the Sony ATV catalog would require fairly unique expertise, would it not?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, it's valuations. Both these valuations are simply based on cash flows. And the cash flows of that entity are then projected out into the future, and then they're discounted back. That's a common valuation technique. I've done it dozens of times.
But they're also based on whether or not you think the hard asset is appreciating, correct?
No, it's not appreciating, because the appraisal tells you whether or not it's appreciating. It's simply based on assumptions with respect to the cash flow stream. The value of those copyrights are nothing more than the cash flow going forward. That's what someone would pay for them. And so you have to make an assumption about how they'll grow, but then they simply apply a multiplier and they discount it back to today's dollars using a discount rate. And so it's a rather, I'm not going to say it's simple, but it's a rather common valuation technique that we use in our business.
And if it's so common to do, why wasn't it done in your analysis?
Well, as I said, I did consider the MIJAC valuation as of 2003 and the Sony ATV valuation of 2003. I did consider that.
You did no analysis regarding what the marketability of his interests were in either of those assets during that point in time, and if he were to market those assets, what his condition would have been afterwards, correct?
No, that's not true. No, I did. I considered that.
Well, I just showed you a letter from March 2003 where his lawyer actually does that, and you said you didn't do any analysis like that, right?
No, I said I didn't see the letter, and I didn't do a formal appraisal.
Okay.
But I certainly took a look at what I believed the values to be of those assets. Not the whole catalog, because you can't value the whole catalog. It's just Mr. Jackson's interest. But I certainly considered the value of the MIJAC catalog and the Sony ATV catalog as of February of 2003.
But correct me if I'm wrong. You said you don't know how marketable that interest was, either individually or jointly with Sony at that time, right?
No, I think what I said was Sony would have to approve any sale. How marketable it is, I don't know.
Okay. Did you ever do any analysis as to whether or not Mr. Jackson's assets were appreciating in value between 1999 and February of 2003?
I believe that the catalogs were actually, that Mr. Jackson's interest in both MIJAC and Sony ATV were depreciating. The Neverland Ranch I've just always assumed at the value that was put in, I think in 1999, by one of his advisors.
Sir, if Mr. Jackson's interest in the Sony ATV catalog went from $47 million in 1986 to selling half of it for $90 million in 1995, and then was estimated, the entire catalog was estimated at $1 billion in 2003, based on the document you saw, how can you say it's diminishing in value?
Because when you look at the way the money gets disbursed to the partners on the sale, and you look at how much money has been advanced to Mr. Jackson over the years, he gets $6.5 million guaranteed every year on that. While that's going on, Sony should be getting $6.5 million, and they're not. So that means that they are, in fact, accruing a liability on an annual basis. In addition to that, Sony is making substantial investments in additional copyrights expenses which Mr. Jackson is not contributing to, so that liability increases. So I literally cash flowed a model out and looked at when anybody could expect to get cash out of the Sony ATV catalog, and it's like out into 2015 that someone would get that value, cash flows. When you discount that back to today's dollars, it's not as much as you think.
Does anything happen in the year 2006 regarding liquidity of that catalog, to your knowledge?
Well, there's a put option that happens in December of 2005, which Mr. Jackson could sell for $200 million to Sony.
What else is available?
I don't recall. I think at some point in time it can be sold. But again, the interest is what the cash flow values are, and when you look at the actual cash flows that will result off that interest, there's been a substantial amount of pre-drawing, if you will, of disbursements.
But you saw documents that indicated what Sony's making on the catalog.
Well, you see a financial statement that shows what the entire partnership is making.
Okay, so what you're saying is, based upon the obligations Mr. Jackson's assumed, you think value has been lost with each year, is that correct?
I do, yes.
Okay, but you're not taking into account the value of the music around the world and what markets might be available for that music, true?
No, I am. I'm taking into account the cash flows that the partnership's generating.
Okay, alright. Now, you indicated, by the way, did you look to see whether Neverland has increased in value?
I didn't, no. I think at some point in time there was a value, and I just assumed that value.
And what year what year was there a value that you assumed?
I thought there was a number in there. I think it was sometime in the 2000 range. About $50 million.
Okay, if I may take just 1 second, Your Honor.
You may.
Thank you. As far as his expenditures go, you don't know, generally speaking, who he's spending money on, do you?
No. There is some detail in the records, yes.
How much detail would you say?
As I mentioned, in the 1999 memo it shows the expenditures for the Neverland Ranch and security, it shows for professional and legal, it shows for personal, it shows for other, so there are details in there. There's a listing of all the employees that work at Neverland Ranch. There is detail at times.
Do you think that detail accounts for all of the expenditures you've identified today?
Well, I think that the work done by Mr. Jackson's financial consultants would take into account all the expenditures. I don't know why they would have a reason to misstate those expenditures.
No, I don't mean the amount. I mean the actual whatever the money was actually spent on. Did you get detail to that effect?
As I mentioned, for 1999 we have detail.
Okay.
And there is other detail. But Holthouse was the ones writing the checks. They would know where all the money went.
Excuse me?
Holthouse was writing the checks. They would know where that money went.
Did you see a detailed accounting of where every dollar was spent?
No.
Okay, no further questions.
Counsel?
Mr. O'Brien, you mentioned that you did an analysis of Mr. Jackson's interest in the Sony ATV catalog, as well as an analysis of the value of the MIJAC catalog in coming to the conclusions that you've stated to the jury today. Is that correct?
I did consider those values, yes.
And you've also stated that you arrived at those values based on a cash flow analysis?
That's correct. That's how you value that investment.
What do you mean by a cash flow analysis?
The cash that actually is paid to someone over a period of time. That's the cash flow.
Okay.
How that cash flows to you and what you're willing to pay for that investment is how much cash you will get in the cash flow that you get out of it. That's a common valuation methodology.
So those catalogs are only worth you arrive at your value based on what kind of income streams they produce.
Right.
Okay, so tell us about your analysis of the MIJAC catalog. What were your findings or what were your conclusions about the value of the MIJAC catalog based upon your cash flow analysis in this case?
Well, the MIJAC catalog, I believe, has gone down in value from 1999. The revenues, the royalties stream has gone down by almost 30% from the 1997, 98, 99 time frame, into 00, 01, 02, 03. And by virtue of the fact that the cash flow stream goes down, the value goes down. That's just it's the way the model works. You simply multiply the revenue stream times the multiplier. So if, in fact, the revenue stream goes down, the value goes down, and that makes sense. So that's gone down.
Okay.
And on the Sony ATV, it was exactly as I described, and that is that the amount of money which Mr. Jackson and or his entities have been taking out on an annual basis and or not paying into the partnership on an annual basis has created a growing liability. And by the time you pay back that growing liability, there is a substantial amount of time that will pass before you see cash flows out of that. There's a guaranteed amount of $6.5 million, I think, through 2005. And that goes down to $2 million. And then after that, it's just the actual amounts. But when those actual amounts are paid, you have to first repay the amounts that Sony hasn't been paid, and or the investments that they've made that in fact they have not been paid back for, including interest. And I looked at that and it's a long while, once you get through this guaranteed portion, before you'll see a cash flow on that investment.
So based on everything that you've considered, I believe you said that Sony is putting more royalties, more copyrights into that catalog as time goes on?
They continue to invest.
Mr. Jackson is taking more than his share out in terms of cash on an annualized basis?
Objection. Misstates the evidence.
I wouldn't say he's taking more than his share, but...
Just a moment.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Well, I'll allow the answer. You may.
I wouldn't say he's taking more than his share. I would say that Sony isn't getting their share.
So is the catalog producing what was anticipated when this agreement was originally reached?
I don't know when it was anticipated, or when it was reached. I don't know.
So tell us about this, the structure of Mr. Jackson's interest in the ATV catalog.
Objection. Foundation.
Overruled. You may answer.
You mentioned he doesn't own half of that catalog today on an asset basis. In other words, if it's worth $1 billion, He doesn't own $500 million, doesn't have a $500 million interest in that catalog. Is that correct?
Well, he owns half of the catalog.
Yes.
But his interest in the catalog is not worth half of the catalog value.
Alright, so.
Because of the front-end loading of the cash flow stream that has gone to him and not gone to Sony.
So if the catalog gets sold, then Sony walks away with more money than Mr. Jackson?
Yes, because he has to repay all of the advances on all of the investments that Sony has made. Absolutely.
And you stated that Mr. Jackson has a right to sell his interest in that catalog for $200 million. Is that correct?
There is a put option. That means I can, it's a technical term in financial. It means I can put this opportunity to you, and that put option is worth $200 million. Starting on December 2005, Mr. Jackson can force Sony to pay him $200 million for that investment for his share.
And I think you previously testified that in February of 2003, that asset, his Sony ATV catalog, was mortgaged to the tune of $200 million. Is that correct?
That's right. But remember, you also have to consider the taxes on that. If you sell that, you're going to pay taxes.
Good point. Tell me what happens, from a tax basis, if Mr. Jackson has to sell his Sony ATV interest for $200 million to pay off that $200 million loan.
His basis is somewhere around $40 million, meaning his cost basis. So you'd subtract the 200 from the 40, and you get a gain of about $160 million, and you'd basically calculate it in what's called capital gains rates, which federal and state would be about 25%, so you'd pay about $40 million in taxes.
Now, you said that he can exercise this put option asking Sony to purchase that catalog in December of 2005, correct?
That's correct.
When is that loan due, that $200 million loan?
December 20th, 2005.
Now, assuming, as Mr. Mesereau asked you to do, assuming that he was just going to sell his interest in the Sony ATV catalog back in, let's say, 2003, okay, February of 2003, and assuming Sony agreed and said, we'll sell our interest. We'll sell it on the open market. Using your cash flow analysis, can you get us in a range, a reasonable range on a cash flow basis what Mr. Jackson's interest would be in the sale of that Sony ATV catalog, if it were to occur?
It would be.
Objection. Foundation.
He's testified he did a cash flow analysis. Counsel asked him this question as part of his opinion.
All right, I'll allow the answer. As I understand the question, he's asking you what interest he would have if it were sold.
That is the question.
The catalog were sold.
In 2003, that interest was probably worth a couple $100 million.
Okay. Now, moving on to the MIJAC catalog, you said that you did a cash flow analysis on that. Give us the same analysis in terms of what that catalog was worth to Mr. Jackson back in 2003.
Well, as I mentioned, the royalties had dropped about 25%, 33%, excuse me. So if you take 33% off the value of $128 million, then it comes up to somewhere between $75 and $80 million.
And he's also asked you some questions about Neverland. Do you know if Neverland has a mortgage on it?
Neverland is cross-collateralized with one of the Sony ATV loans to the extent of $18 million.
What do you mean by cross-collateralized?
The collateral on the MIJAC loan, the $24 million loan, which is now $70 million, is collateralized by the MIJAC catalog. The bank has asked for additional collateral, including an $18 million lien on Neverland.
Why would a bank ask for additional collateral on a $70 million loan?
They want more collateral.
Would it have anything to do with the perception of what that catalog was worth?
Certainly.
And what would the tax ramifications be if Mr. Jackson was to sell his Sony, or sell his MIJAC catalog for, let's say, $70 million?
It would be the same calculation. The investment was about $10 million. So you'd have about a $60 million gain. I'm just rounding it to 70. Less $10 million, or $60 million, at 25% would be about a $10 million tax, so you'd have a net of $50, $60 million.
Okay. So summarizing everything, is it your testimony that Mr. Jackson's ATV catalog is fully mortgaged? In other words, let me back up. As of February of 2003, Your testimony is that the Sony ATV catalog was worth $200 million, approximately?
Objection. Misstates the evidence. No foundation.
I think that's a.
Just a minute.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I should rephrase that, Your Honor.
All right, rephrase it.
Your testimony is that that catalog, Mr. Jackson's financial interest in that catalog, the Sony ATV catalog, in February of 2003 was worth approximately. I know we're not talking about a sharp pencil here, but approximately $200 million?
Objection. Foundation.
Overruled. He's asking you if that's what you've already testified to.
That's correct.
Okay, and there's a loan against it at that time for $200 million?
That's correct.
And if he sells that asset for $200 million, he has to come up with another $40 million from somewhere to pay taxes?
That's correct.
He also has another $10 million in unpaid vendors that he has to come up with?
As of February 13th, that's correct.
Okay, and if he sells his MIJAC catalog for $70 million, which is about you stated that's about what it's worth.
Approximately.
It is encumbered or there are loans against that catalog to the tune of about $70 million?
$70 million, correct.
And if he sells that catalog, then he incurs an additional $10 million in taxes?
That's correct.
You previously testified that Mr. Jackson was accruing debt at a rate of about, I believe it was, $20 to $30 million a year?
That's correct. To fund living expenses.
So his living expenses were exceeding his income for that amount per year?
Correct.
And as a financial advisor, is that an advisable course of action for somebody?
None that I would give.
Okay. As far as providing you with information, is it true that I personally have not provided your office with anything in terms of me giving you documents?
Do you mean you personally?
Yes.
I don't know where the documents came from. I assume they came from your office. But you didn't hand me any document, no.
Very well. Did Chris Linz of our office, who you've mentioned, do you know who she has?
Yes, I've met Chris Linz.
Was she your contact point in the district attorney's office?
With respect to documents, I mean we spoke to you about documents.
Yes.
We spoke to Miss Linz. And my understanding was Miss Linz was the one that passed documents to us.
And were you given an opportunity, you or your staff given an opportunity to go through all of the DA's records to review documents for purposes of your analysis and opinions in this case?
Yeah, we were made available to all the documents I believe you had.
No restrictions whatsoever?
No, the only thing was that some just wasn't available.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
It's about time for the break, Mr. Mesereau.
Oh.
Unless you were just going to ask one question.
No, Your Honor.
All right,